A few years ago, I reached out to Bioshock director Ken Levine on Twitter and I asked him why this game didn't have any sea monsters. His response was a courteous jab at himself and his team, but it was hiding a deeper reality that my young mind would not have been ready for. For as you see, and as we'll discuss in this video, man is the biggest sea monster of all. Hi. I'm AesirAesthetics, and assuming my dumb opening hasn't scared you away, I'd like to welcome you to the third Shock game analysis. Today, we'll be exploring Bioshock in depth, and we'll be picking up where my System Shock 2 analysis left off. Since this video is a look into the Shock series, it goes without saying that it will include possible spoilers for every game in it. I recommend playing them before watching, because a hands-on experience will be almost necessary to participate in this expedition. Aside from that, there's also the case of these being interesting games in their own right, which are best appreciated on their own terms first. Previous entries into this series are linked below in case you want to see what we'll be building on in this video. The Shock series is a collection of games connected by a spiritual thread. This thread was created by Looking Glass Studios and ran through System Shock 1, System Shock 2, Bioshock, Bioshock 2, and Bioshock Infinite. It changed hands a few times from Looking Glass to Irrational Games to 2K Marin back to Irrational. In case you didn't watch my videos on the System Shock games, here's the gist of it. An artificial intelligence named Shodan ran amok, and then, many years later, it returned to temporarily aid the player in their fight against a body horror hive mind called the Many. These two games received critical acclaim but underperformed financially, and over the next years the games would become cult favorite abandonware which housed, within their respective inaccessible experiences, a treasure trove of lessons for any aspiring game designer. Them being forgotten was not without the developers kicking and screaming. Ken Levine had pitched a System Shock 3 to EA which was rejected on purely a monetary basis. In the years that followed, Looking Glass Studios would disappear, and Irrational Games would have sustained themselves by working on other titles like Freedom Force and the fantastic SWAT 4. As the years passed, the developers at Irrational must have been drawn back to the good old days, because they had for some time wanted to make a game more in line with what System Shock 2 and the old Looking Glass games had been. Bioshock's development history reads as a very intimate story, and the first glimpse of that is seen in the timestamp of the first significant piece of development, 2002. This is a game that took a while to brew, and it went through several iterations. Everything from a space setting to a story about a cult deprogrammer. There was a time when the project looked to be dead in the waters, which is where the saving grace of this tumultuous development process occurred. News of a System Shock 2 spiritual successor reached the infosphere, and the positive feedback from fans prompted Irrational to refocus their efforts. Later, Irrational would partner up with 2K Games as a publisher and balloon the size of their development team. This caused some internal friction, but a concept level created by two team members was able to bring everyone together. This area was labeled Great Bioshock Space, and it created a renewed focus on departments working together. It was also around this time in development when the cyberpunk theme was dropped in favor of an underwater theme. When Bioshock finally launched, it did so to become a critical, but more importantly, financial success. The first time for a Shock series title. Bioshock, unlike the previous Shock games, couldn't be offhandedly summarized with a comparison to another game, and it was such a well of material for pop culture to explore. Cosplayers, fan artists, and everyone looking for refuge from the incoming multiplayer shooter craze flocked to this game. A word that got thrown around to describe Bioshock at launch was innovative. In particular, this was thrown around in regards to the game's presentation of narrative. But that's a fallacy. Bioshock was not innovative so much as it was augmentative. Because Bioshock just took the formula that already worked and did it in a mainstream game. The System Shock games were the real innovative titles, as they had laid the groundwork that Bioshock got praised for. Of course, augmentative is not a criticism, because Bioshock did a good job of preserving what it could carry over, adapting what it needed, and ditching what it didn't. The biggest change Bioshock made to the Shock DNA was having in spades something the older games did not: accessibility. And that change was to fulfill at least two large goals of the game. First, Bioshock had to make money. And second, to facilitate a larger thematic shift. System Shock 2 focuses on the player character and their journey, but Bioshock is about the world which the player inhabits. This is why Bioshock ditched the dedicated level ups for a more flexible gene tonic system. It's why the player gets half their tools and 3 plasmids within 2 hours of play. And it's why Bioshock's side characters are used to present concepts and ideas, and are not just avenues the player uses to progress the horror. The core of the Shock series was still intact, however. Like the System Shock games, Bioshock places a clear priority on environmental engagement over on-rails storytelling, and the large strokes that define all 3 games are essentially the same: isolation, environment as narrator, and last sane man versus freaks of genetics. The story of how Bioshock came to be is important to this video because it gives us context for understanding Bioshock's place in history, and because it shows us the state of the Shock series at this point in time. Having just gone over the human drama behind the game, let's reorient ourselves to the game itself. Bioshock opens on a brief cutscene which establishes the time period and the tone of the game. The player character is named Jack, and he's the only survivor of a mid-Atlantic ocean plane crash. After swimming through beautiful water, the player makes their way to the lighthouse, whose immediate impression introduces the philosophical framework that denizens of Rapture made out to live under. After entering a bathysphere, the player is introduced to Andrew Ryan as they watch an infomercial he narrates. He further cements the objectivist philosophy in the opening, and then the player sees and is transported through the underwater city of Rapture itself. Upon entering it, they witness a man named Johnny, who was sent there to greet the player, get disemboweled by a mutated freak of nature called a splicer. They then kindly pick up the shortwave radio and start getting instructions from a man named Atlas. Many of you watching are no doubt fully aware of what's really happening in the story, but for all of those who aren't and still rejected my opening spoiler warning, I'll delay discussing the bombshell to give you time to shut the video down and play the game. Atlas guides the players through a padded gauntlet where they'll learn the fundamentals of combat. They receive the first of the game's 3 driving goals, which is to save Atlas's family, and they're introduced to the functions and inner workings of Bioshock's world. Bioshock is one of the most interesting video game worlds ever created, and it's very apt at telling the story of people taking their ideologies too far. The very first sense the player gets of that is seeing that a man, by the strength of his convictions, actually built a city on the bottom of the ocean. Ideologically timid people don't do that. Like in the System Shock games, the player's immediate post-tutorial area is a medical area. The player enters the medical pavilion and starts their trek across the dilapidated city, where they'll uncover horrors and beauty across a story that picked up the themes System Shock 2 left behind and elevated them to new heights. The carryover design ethos brought into this game from System Shock 2 in terms of the world building are a focus on claustrophobia and isolation, an interactive setting, and a realized setting. The world building accomplished in the opening prepared the player for the medical pavilion, where their goal is to get a key from a deranged surgeon named Dr. Steinman. Bioshock ditched the Metroidvania world design of its spiritual predecessors and instead structured the world like a linear theme park. Every area acts as a new section of the park, but ultimately there's a clear beginning and an end. These areas are all fairly open spaces with ample material to explore, and they are always used to tell the stories of the characters residing there. The medical pavilion tells the player everything they need to know about Dr. Steinman's philosophy and then some. Additionally, each area is also introducing the player to Andrew Ryan. The choice of Rapture as a setting came about after the game had been in development for some time. It had gone through various iterations, ranging from a spaceship to an abandoned Nazi lab on an isolated island. As we touched on earlier, the team at Irrational had grown tired of the cyberpunk theme and wanted something different. What spurred them to conceive of an underwater city is beyond me, but it's an idea that stuck. It checked all the boxes they knew their world needed to check, and it was an interesting enough setting that it would easily be remembered. There was, however, a problem. Why? Why a city on the bottom of the ocean? Who would build a city on the bottom of the ocean, and to what ends? Irrational's quite rational answer was Andrew Ryan. If you watched my videos on System Shock 1 and 2, you'll recall that I referred to Shodan and the Many as omnipresent enemies. Their dread-inspiring presence loomed within every shadowed hallway the player had to traverse. For the purposes of Bioshock's building on System Shock 2's framework, Andrew Ryan fills the shoes left by those two and then some, because the city is him. When the player entered the bathysphere in the lighthouse, they unknowingly agreed to a one-way ticket into Ryan's world, into a physical manifestation of his mind. Near the end of System Shock 2, the player was, quote-unquote, swallowed by the Many. Within their grotesque body horror nightmare, they'd explore the opposing theme of AI gone wrong. They'd see the horror of flesh. It was an effective moment, which Bioshock piggybacks on to an amazing effect. Though it's not as visually clear, the player is swallowed by Ryan. And unlike System Shock 2, this experience isn't limited to a single level. In order to continue discussing the world, let's take a quick crash course in objectivist philosophy. Bioshock's world is inspired by the literary works of political philosopher Ayn Rand. She established the objectivist movement, which is a philosophy founded on the principles of individualism and laissez-faire capitalism, and, in Rand's own words, the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. Andrew Ryan is named after Ayn Rand, and he also inherits her philosophical beliefs. Only, for there to be any real conflict in this game, Bioshock presupposes a fallacy in Ayn Rand's logic on which to frame its core theme that ideological extremes are dangerous. Bioshock asks the question, what if man isn't rational? What if he's suspect to the whims of unseen forces that tempt him to act in amoral ways? What if people aren't paragons capable of embodying their philosophy, and what if instead they were broken and human and made mistakes? Just a quick side note, Bioshock is not about objectivism, nor is it a critique of capitalism. It's about the tendencies humans have towards inflicting upon each other harm. The developers made the game to explore the dangerous combination of people and ideological extremes. It could have been socialism, or feudalism, or a theocracy, provided that the people in the world weren't divorced from human faults. The world Ryan left behind had been responsible for all manner of gross acts, ranging from religious purges to civilian starvation, and he had, within his lifetime in it, witnessed both the Leninist Revolution in Russia and the Holocaust. These are all horrible things done by ideological extremists. The only reason I'm bringing objectivism up is to understand the motivations of the characters and the functions of the society. The relevance it has in the game doesn't go any further than that. And hey, let's refrain from turning the comment section into a political cesspool, yeah? On principle, I won't remove anything I see, but I think it's disingenuous and a complete misunderstanding of the game to use it as a platform for ideological debate. Getting back to the subject at hand, Rapture's lived-in world picks up the level design ethos from System Shock that states areas should function as a real place first, game world second. Real in this sense refers to the ability of the place to act as an area wherein a society could function, not real as in realistic. When the player makes their way to Rapture, it's in a state of absolute madness. What Ryan built to be a refuge from the tyranny of everywhere else has become an unescapable nightmare that's kept alive by his will. Its denizens, handpicked by Ryan as humanity's best and brightest, are now mostly freaks of genetics. The player's journey is that of the last sane man with the occasional radio transmission to keep them company. Because of this, the game uses the environments to tell most of the story. The environments and audio logs. Audio logs were an inclusion brought in from System Shock, and their purpose in this game is to explore concepts and answer some of the player's questions. Bioshock's use of the environment as a narrator helped bring the term environmental storytelling into the gaming lexicon. The player walks past various life-size dioramas, hastily scribbled messages, and the bloody aftermath of the Rapture Civil War. This is something Bioshock has over the System Shock games, largely because there's a bigger emphasis on story and because Bioshock was afforded the luxury of launching in the era of quality visuals. That being said, there are still a lot of tricks used to keep performance in check. An obvious example is presenting the outside environments with textures, but a more subtle example is the game's use of Art Deco. Art Deco is a very easy architecture style for computers to replicate, and it has the great side effect of tying Rapture to Rockefeller Center and various other geographical symbols of capitalism, being that it was the style and popular philosophy of those times. Having that visual callback makes it so that Rapture feels like someone's antiquated vision of the future, like a twisted Tomorrowland. This is also reflected in the music, which invokes the grandiose sounds of the hopeful 1920s. Of course, the current state of Rapture is anything but, and this music does a great job of contrasting the sights and sounds on display. Mostly, however, the player will not be listening to music, they'll be surrounded by ambient noises. Leaking water, crumbling infrastructure, and mumbles of splicers screaming amongst and often at themselves. The key noises the player looks out for are the rusty camera swivels, the footsteps of enemies, and the advertisements of vendors. I guess I could say that these sounds help Bioshock's world come to life. Horrible, miserable life. Because it's not a living, breathing world in the first place. It's a dying, battered thing that feels like it should be put down for its own sake. The Rapture experience is an exploring events that have passed in the eerie remains of a world that was. The world as narrator is more impactful here than in many other games, because the world's choice of narrator tells the player more than in those other games. They learn what the plasmids they buy do by watching a visual tutorial framed as an ad. And they learn about Adam because they witness it in commercials and on posters. Adam came about in the story due to the laissez-faire economy being free to research and explore without any moral barriers. A woman named Bridget Tannenbaum discovered sea slugs with amazing healing properties, and further studies showed that it could also let people alter their own genetic makeup. It was to medicine what oil was to transportation. A game changer. The funding of Tannenbaum's research came from a man named Frank Fontaine, and if there's a single moment to point at to explain what caused Rapture's collapse, this is it. Fontaine was poised to make a fortune from the monopoly on Adam, and it frightened Andrew Ryan enough to abandon the free market. There was a cold battle between the two, which eventually brewed to a boil and resulted in a shootout and Ryan acquiring all of Fontaine's assets. The story of Fontaine and his feud with Ryan is largely told to the player in Neptune's Bounty, which is the area the player enters after killing Steinman. Bioshock's world is great. Back in System Shock 1, the areas were designed to fit the slow and somewhat clunky cyberpunk action. System Shock 2 was also slow, but it was a lot deeper and it explored science fiction horror. Bioshock is a faster game than both, and its mechanic depth is somewhere in between the two. Unlike in System Shock, the choices in Bioshock emerge from things the player sees and not numbers hiding under the hood. The theme of choice runs deep through this game, and the player will have many opportunities to study the choices which characters made in this world. Choices that turned Rapture into what it is, and this exploration, open to the player, showcases strongly the game's central theme of exploring the dangerous mix of people and ideological extremes, and doing so whilst also being about walking, looting, and shooting. After the player leaves Neptune's bounty, they go to the smuggler's hideout. This area has some lore attached to it, but it's significant in the story because it's where the game's central goal changes. Ryan seemingly kills Atlas's family and forces both the player and Atlas to flee. After making their way to Arcadia, the player receives their new goal from a furious Atlas who asks the player to kill Ryan. The player has thus far traversed about a third of the game, so they'd be very familiar with the gameplay. What was originally designed in System Shock 1 has seen major reworkings as this series progressed, and as we went through earlier, Bioshock redesigned the gameplay to fit the changed focal point of the game from player character to the world. Something Bioshock added to this series was the inclusion of an internal ecosystem. In System Shock 2, the presence of an enemy was always a threat that was either to be dealt with, hid from, or escaped. Bioshock, on the other hand, has agents that act outside of the conventional shooter formula, and these agents help sell Rapture as an internally realized game world without disturbing the core of the Shock series gameplay formula. Player progression demands the acquisition of resources. The scarcity of those resources incentivizes the player to loot all corpses and defeated enemies, as well as scrounge around in desks and trash bins. Doing this makes them search every nook and cranny of the world, which makes it a more memorable place in space. It also nets the player the audio logs, which give them passive story to listen to while they play. Those stories are usually there to explore questions the player might have and to address various ideological conflicts. That means the player's exploration of the world is supplemented with stories that intellectually and emotionally stimulate them, which further ingrains the world in their mind and reinforces the player's role in it as the last sane man, the final survivor. Being that they are the final survivor, they'll need to continue surviving for survival's sake, and that demands resources, which triggers this loop all over again. The internal ecosystems are brought about by the game's AI. In an interview, which I've linked below, Ken Levine stated that the AI is what he was most proud of from this game. It gave the world's separate agents separate functions and behaviors. Couple that with a vast arsenal of plasmids, weapons, and environment entities, and the player has an amazing amount of ways to read the world. Bioshock challenged the linear go from point A to point B structure, not just by letting the player explore along the way, but also by presenting story progression and world building as a naturally forming phenomenon. Both are tied to the game's reliance on drivers, which is another big leap for the Shock series. Just quickly, when I say drivers, I don't mean emergent gameplay. Emergent gameplay refers to scenarios in games that result from the clashing of one or more of their mechanics and systems. An example here is running from Splicer machine gun fire behind a Big Daddy, having the Splicer hit them, and watching the Big Daddy go to town on the unfortunate Splicer. A driver, in this context, refers to behaviors within the world that drive the behavior of the player. Seeing splicers grouped in water makes most players use the electricity as their opening attack move. The function of turrets incentivizes the player to draw groups of enemies to those turrets they've hacked in order to save themselves resource costs. The difficulty of the game drives the player to research all enemies with a research camera, which replaced the research skill from System Shock 2. The difficulty also incentivizes the player to get more gene tonics and plasmids, which cost Adam, which drive the player to fight the Big Daddies. Therefore, locking Adam behind the Big Daddies created a system of roving boss battles. The function of the world is presented to the player by the mechanisms and rules that objects in the world behave under and by how the player can and cannot interact with them. This is something that would not have been possible in the System Shock games, and I really like this setup because it creates a very naturally forming experience. The Big Daddy Little Sister duo are a big part of that ecosystem I referred to earlier, and the supplementary stories surrounding them give them an added presence in the story. Fontaine using little girls to grow Adam and the genetically altered workers being made to protect them is pretty chilling stuff. Arcadia is a big lull in the story, and things don't really pick up again until Fort Frolic. That's good, because the sudden change of narrative goal pretty much demanded that the story slow down to let the player gather their senses. It's in this part of the story where Ryan releases a toxic into the air which will kill all the plants. The player needs to find something called the Lazarus Vector to prevent this. Every goal in Bioshock is getting from point A to point B. That's a very simple setup necessitated by the game being a spatial simulator, but simple does not mean negative. Every goal feeds into the game's focus on the world because they make the player explore and thus get them exposed to the various storytelling agents in this game. Of all the changes from System Shock 2, the one I'd critique this game for dropping was the stealth. System Shock 2 inherited it from the game engine it borrowed from Thief the Dark Project, and it helped drive the player character experience. Bioshock is about the world, so a system that encourages players to traverse efficiently might not necessarily have been a good inclusion. But my critique is that that's not how stealth in System Shock 2 worked. In that game, the player was severely more underpowered than in Bioshock, and they'd use stealth as a means of survival. But they were still always exposed to almost every part of the game. Additionally, stealth made the player slow down and take in their environments. Bioshock doesn't do that. Oftentimes, the player goes into a shop only to pick up an audio log and fight a splicer. The quiet moments of uninterrupted world building are strangely more memorable in System Shock 2, and I'd attribute that to the stealth. It forced the player to be more cognizant over their progression, and it made them analyze the moment-to-moment gameplay with a lot more depth than Bioshock ever accomplished. If I had to rationalize this change, however, I'll make the argument that ensuring the player more opportunities to engage with the world better fits the overall design structure of Bioshock, and that it would have been too hard if there was significant systems that enabled stealth. I don't necessarily think that's true, but for the sake of continuing on with the video, it's the best justification I can rationally use to relent my criticism. This is a criticism not often laid against the game. The one you're likelier to hear is about the Little Sister morality system. The player gets Adam from them by choosing to either harvest or rescue them. The former option gives the player more Adam, but the latter makes them feel good and gives them periodic Adam drops from the sisters they've already saved. The ramifications this has on the story is very shallow. Harvesting nets the player the bad endings, rescuing gets them the good ending. The simplicity of this black and white choice system is what the criticism is founded on, but I think that's a fallacy, and I think this inclusion is a lot smarter and does a lot more than people, including a sizable chunk of the development team, gave it credit for. It's being framed within a definitive need brings the player to the same moral ground as the characters around them. Everyone in Rapture became what they are to fulfill a need. Some spliced up purely as a survival instinct after the Civil War broke out. Others, like Steinman, are acting in the service of the needs present in their lives, abhorrent as they are to us. The story of Rapture is the story of people trying to act within their understanding of objectivist philosophy and failing on the grounds of their moral fallacies and irrational tendencies. I don't like this morality system because it branches the narrative. I like it because it places the player on the same moral ground as the characters in the game had faced with confronting objectivism. From a purely utilitarian perspective, harvesting makes the most sense. But because there are drivers outside of pure self-interest and one-sided rationalities, most players will go through the game without harvesting and without so much as giving that choice a second thought. This whole implementation, I think, is wonderful. Not because it fragments the narrative, but because it accomplishes a lot of player character building and because it makes the player confront head-on the struggle of the world. Also, it's a choice. And choice is a big thing in this game. Since making my System Shock 2 video, I've softened my stance on customizable experiences. I'm sure Bioshock could have been a deeper, richer game if it had been more stern in its relationship with the player, but only for a specific kind of player. There are a lot of players who would have put it down or not picked it up if it would have lacked, say, Vita chambers. And there are a lot of players who are genuinely challenged by a medium difficulty setting. The whole experience is very customizable and, on a whole, that's probably a good thing. It's accessible for the mainstream and it has a lot of workarounds for more experienced players. My optimal playthrough is on the highest difficulty with no quest arrow, no glowing items, and no auto-aim. You'll notice I still keep Vita chambers on, because as much as I think the game can be accessible to a fault, I'm not willing to turn it into a genuine tension-wracking experience, and I don't fancy the idea of replaying 40-minute chunks or autosaving every 10 seconds. I like that in my System Shocks, but not in my Bioshock. Something playing on a higher difficulty does is bringing to mind how the areas weren't designed for fighting, and how the enemies really aren't designed to play fair. Which is genius because it rekindles that simulation spark the series started with. Higher difficulty also forces the player to become more invested in the world. Bioshock, I think, plays best as a mid-tier horror adventure game where hacking becomes necessary everywhere, where the player loots everything and scrounges everywhere, where they're often forced to retreat and where resource limitations drive much of the experience. The inventory present in both System Shock games was ditched in Bioshock. Inventory management made the System Shock games tense and often placed the player in unfortunate scenarios where they'd have to dedicate their playstyles for some time. But because Bioshock is about engaging with the world, a restrictive inventory would have locked much of the content away from the player. Instead, they're limited mostly by the money in their wallet. Since the inventory is gone, there's a lot less for the game to draw on in building tension, but since its core was extracted from a horror game, Bioshock needed to adapt. It's no longer a naturally occurring horror system that is imposed on the player by the player through the skills they don't upgrade, but rather, it's an atmospheric thing. After acquiring items, the player will turn around to a jump scare, and then there are shadows which insinuate terrors from the other side of the corners. Ooh. However, that's mostly window dressing to horror. The real thing is in the characters. In writing this script, I was tossing up whether to discuss the game's use of horror or the characters, when I realized it wouldn't matter because it's the same discussion. The theme of ideological extremism is woven into the characters, so the horror and characters are one. After leaving Arcadia and the farmer's market, the game starts picking up again when the player enters Fort Frolic. Here, they lose communication with Atlas and are introduced to a deranged artist named Sander Cohen. He's stranded the player in Fort Frolic so that they can help him complete his masterpiece by killing his old disciples, photographing them, and then placing the photographs on this thing. Spooky. When I say the horror comes from the characters, I mean to say that it comes from the philosophical certainty of the characters. It's possible to understand them and what drives them to do the things they do, but it's creepy and downright unnerving to see the lengths they'll go to in preserving their philosophical view of the world. They never doubt whether what they're doing is the right thing. Bioshock looks at people who are attempting to make beautiful things. Steinman thinks his human Picassos are beautiful. Cohen thinks that his art is beautiful, and Ryan thinks that his crumbling city is beautiful. These people's idea of beauty is horrific to everyone but themselves, and because they're also devoted to their ideologies, they lack that barrier that would otherwise enable them to pull back. As described by Ken Levine, get an idea, keep doing more and more of it. In an interview which I've linked below, Ken Levine also stated, "I'm not really afraid of genetic technology, atomic weapons, or killer robots. I'm afraid of ideology and the dangers of extreme ideology." Bioshock uses its characters to explore the predominant theme of people and ideologies. It's not just that each one builds up to Ryan, but additionally they all explore various concepts and ideas that are natural to this setting. Some throwaway characters exist purely to let the player know that Rapture needed significant maintenance. Others are there so the player thinks about what it would have been like to grow up in Rapture and never see trees. Others still are just there to showcase the brutal aftermath of the Ryan Fontaine feud. More dominant and recurring characters, however, challenge the player to step away from absolutes and ideologies and showcase how easy it is for the oppressed to become the oppressors. In yet another interview, Ken Levine stated something interesting. Some Bioshock Infinite characters were mixed into this interview, so I'm paraphrasing, but bear with me because it's an interesting insight into the creative process behind the game. Bioshock 1 is about Jews. If you think about it, Andrew Ryan, Sander Cohen, Tenenbaum, Steinman, they're all Jews. Additionally, the character of Yi Soo-chung is Korean, and during World War II, Korea was brutally occupied by Japan. He and all these characters are survivors of oppression, and they don't come out of it as heroes. Oppression turns them into oppressors, which is the cruelest aspect of oppression. Maybe people wanted these games to be written about a hero who rose above that, but most people are destroyed by oppression. These games could tell a fairy tale about people who are ennobled by it, but a cursory look at history reveals just how rare that is. Pretending as if there's a lot of happy endings for those stories, in some ways elevates the oppression into something it's not. The horror in this game is thematic and not mechanic in nature. The characters were all designed to be flawed, and they showcase that ideological certainty is functional only so far as the rationality of the individual idealist is concerned. To Dr. Steinman, his human Picassos are perfectly rational. To Cohen, the direction of his art is perfectly rational. Andrew Ryan believed that building a city on the bottom of the ocean, fighting a civil war, and using pheromones to control the populace was perfectly rational. Their mistake was in taking their ideologies too far. They all got to a point where the adherence to the ideology became more important than the actual ideology or its stated goals. That's why I said it's not about objectivism. It's about that thin line and being unable to pull back. The horror in this game is really about this. The idea that so little stands between man and a monster. After leaving Fort Frolic, the player goes to Hephaestus. Hephaestus is Rapture's main source of energy, and it's built above volcanic vents. This is the last area before reaching Ryan, and it's a good final primer on him as a character. Ryan is a man of industry, so it makes sense for his office to be located near the heart of the city. Andrew Ryan is one of the all-time great video game characters, and he's certainly one of my personal favorites. He's everything Shodan was, and so much more. An omnipresent figure whose dynamic personality almost warps the game space from sheer intrigue. To reach Ryan, the player must first build an EMP device. Just like photographing Cohen's disciples, or Wilkins splicers, like getting Steinman's key or assembling the Lazarus vector, it's a goal that demands exploration. Upon assembling and using it, the player makes their way to Ryan, and this is where I'm going to give those that haven't played the game their final spoiler warning. If any of what we've discussed so far intrigues you, I implore you to put the video down and come back after playing the game yourself. Ready? Okay, let's do this. Bioshock explores several themes. At its core, it explores the dangers of ideological extremes. It also looks at the theme of parenthood and choice, specifically player choice. When the player has made their way to Ryan's office, they're blasted with a wall that completes the setup of the game's big twist. As the player approaches Ryan, he makes them question the reality of Jack's backstory, the family, the farm, the plane crash. He then asks if they would kindly stop and pulls the rug from under them completely. As it turns out, the player has had no agency up until this point. Jack was not a real man, but rather a tool under the control of Atlas. His trigger word,
Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
had been right in front of the player this whole time. Andrew Ryan believes in objectivism. The concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. Jack is a slave. He has no free will, so to Ryan, he's something less than a man. But he's also, shockingly, Andrew Ryan's son. Stolen as a fetus, genetically modified to grow up at an exponential rate and mimetically encoded to come to Rapture, hijack the plane upon receiving his trigger, and help Atlas take Ryan down. The reason for this is because during the Rapture Civil War, Ryan had taken over all bathyspheres, the entire security system, and the Vita chambers. All had been encoded to only work for his genetic sample, which is inside Jack as well. Because he managed to puzzle this together, Ryan plays his final hand. He's set Rapture to self-destruct and has given Atlas his ultimatum. According to Ryan, his city is not in steel and stone, but rather it's an idea. Ryan exemplifies this idea, and to prove, maybe to no one but himself, his devotion to his ideals, Ryan orders Jack to murder him. Afterwards, Atlas makes the player stop the self-destruction of the city and changes its control from Ryan Industries to Fontaine Futuristics, right after revealing his true identity. This is where a lot of debate has emerged about how good of a game Bioshock is and how much better of a game Bioshock could potentially have been. Atlas is actually Frank Fontaine, who faked his own death and orchestrated a long con to bring the atom to the surface in order to make a fortune. The debate over this game is whether or not Bioshock should have ended here instead of continuing for another couple of hours. I'm in the unpopular school of thought that this would have been a bad place to end the story. Like the Little Sister morality system, there are a lot of people on the development side of the game, including Ken Levine, who lament the way they continued the story, but I think they're wrong. Bioshock has 3 narrative goals. The first was to save Atlas's fake family. The second was to kill Ryan, and the last is to stop Fontaine. The reason I think this game continuing after the bombshell is for the better is because it gives us an exploration of the duality of Ryan and Fontaine's characters, and because it pays off the themes of ideology, parenthood, and choice. After killing Ryan, the player is made to be killed by Fontaine, but the intervention of some little sisters prevents that. The player wakes up after a nasty fall to see Bridget Tannenbaum. She houses the little sisters which the player has saved up until this point, and she's removed some of the control Fontaine had over Jack. She explains that he needs to stop him, and that to do so, he needs to study the work of the man who placed the triggers in his brain, Yi Suchong. Here he is, taking a prolonged nap after an encounter with a Big Daddy. Before they're able to stop Fontaine's control, the player loses some of their maximum health as Fontaine uses other triggers to try to hinder the player's progress. The player eventually gets control over their mind and tracks Fontaine down. But before doing so, they take a walk through some of Rapture's housing, and the environments stop telling the story of Ryan the Tyrant and start talking about Fontaine the Fiend. As far back as the original Thief, Ken Levine has leaned on the theme of dualities which the player is stuck in the middle of. In that game, Garrett was an ideologically devoid man stuck in the middle of the pagans and the fundamentalists. In System Shock 2, it was Shodan, the artificial intelligence, and the many, the biological hive mind. The player character was both flesh and machine, so they had an insight into both worlds, but ultimately reject both as absolutes. The ideological dualities the player maneuvers through in this game are the main villain's motivations. Andrew Ryan is solely driven by his ideology. Frank Fontaine lacks any ideology. Ryan can be defined as an objectivist, but at best, Frank Fontaine is a nihilist. The ending of the game explores this theme, and it uses the world to explore Frank Fontaine. We see the housing he built for the poor, and the orphanages he built for abandoned little girls. Noble on the surface, sure, but these things hide a malicious interior. Fontaine is best described in the word predator. He gave the poor housing and soup, knowing that he could subsequently ask for them their lives in the Civil War. He gave the little girls a home, so he would have a steady supply of subjects to turn into little sisters, which he'd use to produce Adam. Ryan believes in something completely. Fontaine believes in nothing. Functionally, Fontaine is the only monster in this game, because unlike all the other characters, he's not at least driven by an ideology. He's only in it for himself. He exemplifies the empty man. And these two men destroyed the lives of everyone in Rapture with their feud. It wasn't just Jack in the middle, everyone suffered when these men clashed. That's why we say the horror is in the characters. Ken Levine explains it like this: the historical basis for this is the greatest horror of all time, the Eastern Front of World War II. On one side, you have Hitler, and on the other, you have Stalin. Two extreme, murdering, ideologically driven scumbags. Everybody else was just caught in the middle. The big twist moment mirrors the Polito is dead scene from System Shock 2, and it effectively reframes the events of the game. It also brings back System Shock 2's unreliable narrator and the theme of the player blissfully accepting whatever truth was presented to them. This moment shakes up the player-game relationship, and another shake is in the Ryan boss battle because, like the previous Shock bosses and enemies, it's about more than conflict. I've made an entire video about this subject, so I'll be brief. The Shock games are pretty clever in framing conflict as more than just violence. They've used it to convey themes like survival, redemption, and choice. And the Ryan fight is another Shock hallmark because it's used to convey a man's devotion to an ideological extreme. Andrew Ryan values his ideological victory over his own life. Him proving himself the master of Jack's will is more important than survival. I understand why a lot of people think the game should have ended when the player learned the truth of Jack's mission, but I think the endgame is good enough that Bioshock would have been something less if it had launched without it. We see, in the endgame, contrasting of Ryan and Fontaine, that Fontaine's weapon was charity, which was something Ryan despised. We see that Jack's choices in regards to the little sisters has consequences only after he is free from mind control. He becomes responsible for the actions which the player undertook. As we discussed earlier, Ken Levine didn't want to make a story about a hero who rose above the vicious cycle of oppression, but, in the good ending at least, that's very much what Jack's story is. Before fighting Fontaine, the player dresses up as a big daddy in order to gain the trust of a little sister who will open doors for them and harvest Adam while they protect her. I like this moment because it puts the player in the shoes of one of the game's ecosystem agents, and because it showcases the theme of parenthood in a way no other game could. Additionally, it gives the player some endgame Adam to beef up their character before fighting Fontaine, and it gives them some quiet time to reflect on their journey up until this point. Finally, it's an odd moment of beauty. The only such moment in the entire game, really. Jack was a mistreated slave throughout the whole thing, and it's nice that he has the choice to guide a little sister's action and gets to be nice to her. After fighting a Fontaine who's drunk on the power of Adam, the player obtains one of 3 endings. This is something Irrational fought against. They wanted for there only to be one ambiguous ending, but they were made to create more to pay off the little sister harvesting choices of the player. In the bad ending, Jack essentially springs Rapture onto an unsuspecting surface world and becomes a new world superpower. In the other bad ending, Jack does the same, but the narration is sad. In the good ending, Jack takes the little sisters he's rescued to the surface, where he gives them a chance of a new life. This is a cap-off to the underlying theme of parenthood more so than the dangers of ideological extremes, which is why I think the bad endings, misplaced as they feel, play better to the central theme of the game. Jack, as a once oppressed, now oppressor, makes him follow into his father's footsteps, and seems to have some thematic gravitas that the good ending doesn't have. That being said, it's more satisfying to see Jack break the cycle and leave Rapture behind. If a man chooses and slave obeys, then it's justifiably satisfying to see Jack not become a slave to the fate of men who get offered power, and instead choose something simpler. Choose, as far as we know, because it's just as likely that Tannenbaum tweaked his brain and made him think that this was the choice he made. Whatever the case, the final scene of this good ending sees Jack dying, seemingly peacefully in old age, surrounded by the little sisters, who've all found for themselves someone to love. For all of the game's stated goals, I feel confident in praising Jack as a protagonist. Bioshock is truly the moment when the Shock series started getting some interesting characters. It had been relying almost solely on Shodan, and to some degree the many up until this point, but Bioshock introduces the player to a lot of interesting concept characters and nails almost all of them out of the park. Because the life in Rapture is more relatable and more human, and because the visual quality better presents a glimpse of life in Rapture, it's easier to empathize with the people in the audio logs than ever before in the Shock series. Bioshock is the go-to personal blockbuster. It's often referred to as the game that best broke the fourth wall, but that's not its great achievement. Bioshock, more than anything else, showcases the dark descents of humanity in dire times. It showcases how ideological pursuits, as moral as individual liberty, can lead to the darkest of tyrannies. It stands as a testament to the power of video game narrative structure. It bends across time and location, zigzagging but never losing focus. And if there is anything it has to teach us going forwards, I'd say it's the game's masterclass in world building. How it showcases that anything from vendors to throwaway characters and items can act as narrators. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. The footage I used was applied by World of Longplays as played by Spasbo4 and by Save as Untitled, both of whom are linked below. Bioshock is an immensely interesting game, and I hope you're watching this video after playing it, and if not, I hope you'll get around to it soon. In the video description, I've left links to other videos I've made on the Shock series, and if you're scrolling down there, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. If there's anything you'd like to contest in this video, or if there's anything you think I missed, be sure to comment, as I'm usually a very active replier, and because I'd like to see what you might have to teach me about the game. For some time now, I've been promising to look at the entire Shock series, but I'm feeling a bit of a burnout, so if it's all the same, I'd like to take a hiatus and instead make a special video I've wanted to do for a long time. That's all the salesmanship I'll offer at this time, but I hope you'll keep an eye out for its eventual release. I'm AesirAesthetics. Thanks again for watching.